G'day, my name's Dev. I'm here on Larrakia country in Darwin at the top end of Australia's Northern Territory. Behind me is our Parliament House, and in this episode I'll discuss the federation of Britain's far-flung Australian colonies into the modern continental nation we enjoy today. It started with the development of a unique Australian identity from within these colonies and was taken forward by an eclectic movement of local visionaries, feminists, socialists, reformers and pastoralists. In a global context, the development of modern Australia is an extraordinary example of liberal thinking and hard work for successful nation building. However, its phenomenology is also controversial because it raped the Australian landscape by destroying ancient eucalyptus forests and crucial freshwater systems. Colonisation introduced a horde of foreign pests which decimated whole communities of native flora and fauna. Most terribly, it neglected tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians and disavowed their connection to this country. Furthermore, it demonised Asian peoples and institutionalised white supremacy for decades. From its desperate beginnings at Sydney Cove in 1788, Australia's colonial expansion spread ambitiously and apocalyptically across the entire continent. Convict transportation, outback exploration, massive pastoralism, Aboriginal resistance, frontier justice, gold rushes, agricultural revolutions, environmental disasters and industrial actions. By the 1890s, colonisation was arguably complete, and Australia as we know it today had become a thing. The entire continent had been mapped, towns and cities had been established, and all the surrounding good country had been turned into farming districts. Further inland, vast tracts of marginal country had been turned into huge ad hoc sheep and cattle properties. Through superhuman efforts, the explorers had proven that there was no inland sea, and the outback centre of the continent was effectively 2 million square kilometres of desert country. It is important to remember that Australia's colonisation was an enormous, world-changing metamorphosis. It pushed thousands of Aboriginal peoples to the outskirts of colonial society, impoverished town camps and Christian missions, where so much esoteric knowledge, ancient language and culture was sadly lost. Colonisation also levelled entire pristine eucalyptus forests across southern Australia and turned them into seemingly endless plains of farmland. Millions of native animals like kangaroos and emus were shot, poisoned and torn apart by dogs, along with millions of sheep and cattle who died horribly of disease and thirst on drought-prone outback properties. Furthermore, colonisation released an international horde of introduced flora and fauna. Cats, cane toads, tiger pear and gamba grass, to name but a few, ran amok through the vulnerable native Australian landscapes, which had been cocooned since the continent separated from Gondwana over 100 million years ago. I think the damage done culturally and ecologically to this continent during colonisation is irreversible, and I don't think it will ever be the same again. But colonisation was an extraordinarily powerful force that was generated philosophically by the Enlightenment and technologically by the Industrial Revolution. It was based on the idea that Western man could change the world with his intellect, willpower and work ethic. Indeed, the Australian continent was conquered quickly. By the 1890s, just over a century after the first fleet had arrived at Sydney Cove in 1788, Australia's great cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane, were all well and truly established colonial societies. These societies had worked hard and had become increasingly educated and well organised. They were progressive, and improvements to railways and telegraph systems increased their communications with each other and the world. This supported nationalism amongst the Australian-born white members of these new colonial societies. By the 1890s, for the first time, they were the comfortable majority of the population. They had their own way of speaking, their own histories, and traditions, and they began celebrating the idea of being Australian in songs and poems. They were Tasmanians, West Australians and South Australians, Queenslanders, Victorians, New South Welshmen and Territorians. But they also called themselves Australians, and as global politics changed, they were increasingly influenced by other emerging federations around the world, particularly the United States and Canada. In the second half of the 19th century, an increasingly serious movement for federation arose within the Australian colonies, but it was plagued by administrative differences. Most notably, they had adopted different width railway tracks, and this irritated trade between themselves. There was also philosophical differences between the colonies. Though similar, they didn't like each other and they could not agree on the collection and allocation of import duties, which further irritated trade between themselves. For example, New South Wales supported free trade, but the other colonies like Victoria advocated for protectionism. Sir Henry Parkes, known as the father of federation, was eventually able to neutralise this problem by proposing that once Australia federated, then the National Parliament could legislate on tariff policy for the whole continent. Race was another divisive factor in the movement towards federation. On the railroads and in the shearing sheds, socialism was growing strong amongst the white Australian workers. They believed that proper unionism required a certain brotherhood that only groups of white working men could achieve. Racism was also present within other branches of early Australian progressivism. The famous first wave Australian feminist, Catherine Helen Spence, saw Chinese immigrants as a threat to the gains her movement was making in the new colonial societies, especially South Australia. In fact, South Australia led the world in political reform, and in 1856 it was the first British colony to extend the right to vote to all white men. It also banned polling booths in pubs, breaking with the traditional practice of candidates buying votes with drinks. South Australia also established the world's first independent electoral body. In 1858, South Australian cricketer turned electoral commissioner William Boothby introduced a ballot paper where an X was to be placed against the names of preferred candidates, with the Boothby ballot now used around the world. Federation was further limited by divisions within the growing Australian labour movement. Religious factors caused disputes over whether federation was desirable or even possible. The labour movement was dominated by Catholics, while pro-federation leaders were almost exclusively Protestants, and some, like Henry Parkes himself, were militantly anti-Catholic. So enthusiasm for federation tended to be weaker amongst Australia's Catholic community. There were also concerns about a possible civil war, especially regarding the tragic events that had unfolded in America between the North and the South. But it was the strong belief amongst many that what the Americans had achieved through war, first against the British and then against themselves, the Australians could do through peace. The powerful colony of Victoria had supported federation since the 1850s, but its competitors in New South Wales were concerned that Victoria's greater wealth and population would decrease its influence over the proposed nation. Like the Australian Republican movement in the modern era, enthusiasm for uniting the colonies ebbed and flowed until it was resurrected in the 1880s, but not by trade policies or new railways, but instead by international relations. In 1883, Queensland annexed eastern New Guinea to stop an expansionist Germany from moving into the Pacific. But Britain disallowed this and the Germans were able to control it. The British government was swamped by colonial issues, so they suggested that the Australians should federate if they wanted to expand or better protect themselves from foreign powers. The annexation crisis mobilised the Australian Natives Association, or ANA. Once an insurance body for its Australian-born white male-only members, the ANA became a powerful nationalist pro-federation organisation. Although Australia already had one of the most urbanised populations on Earth, the Bulletin, a popular right-wing magazine, encouraged pro-federation nationalism that embraced the independent white bushman as its icon. To sanctify this image, it championed the famous bush poetry of Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson. But like any revolution, Federation needed a leader. Sir Henry Parkes was Premier of New South Wales 5 times, making him the longest non-consecutive leader in the state's history. A natural politician, he had had an extraordinary life. Born poor in the West Midlands of England, he worked a variety of hard jobs in his youth, including, I quote, breaking stones on the Queen's Highway with hardly enough clothing to protect himself from the cold. He self-educated and to escape poverty emigrated to Sydney with his wife in 1839. He started as a low-paid labourer, then became a customs officer, a debtor, a poet, an ivory and bone turner, a journalist, a successful businessman, and eventually a successful politician. He associated himself with the radical patriots in the colony. With these radicals, Parkes pushed for universal suffrage and campaigned against the transportation of British convicts. He worshipped free trade, but was committed to the transformation of the Australian colonies into a federal republic. One afternoon in 1889, Parkes was getting on the piss with the Governor of New South Wales, Lord Carrington, aka Champagne Charlie, when Carrington famously dared him to confederate the Australian colonies within 12 months. Parkes accepted the dare, and later, at Tenterfield in northern New South Wales, he made a famous speech where he demanded an Australian nation and proposed a convention of colonial parliamentary representatives to devise its constitution. In 1891, the National Australasian Convention met and endorsed the federation of a new nation, the Commonwealth of Australia. It was a revolutionary moment for our country and produced the fundamentals of the federal system we have today. It is commonly unknown today, but the 1890s was an especially hard decade for the Australian colonies. We experienced a crushing economic depression, militant shearing strikes, and bloody frontier warfare across northern Australia. But the Federalist Conventions continued, with an ageing Parkes passing the responsibility onto a younger New South Wales politician, Edmund Barton, who was also known as Toby Tosspot for his heavy drinking. During the 1897-98 convention, delegates developed the Australian Constitution. It took accountability of the government to Parliament from the British, the power of the courts to declare laws unconstitutional from the Americans, referendum provisions from the Swiss, and other bits and pieces from Canada and the Australian colonies. This Frankenstein constitution was finalised in 1899 and transmitted to the UK for ratification by the British Parliament. With Britain's approval, the Commonwealth of Australia was born on the 1st of January 1901. It was a new continental nation at the beginning of a brave new century. It had the heavy drinking Edmund Barton as its first Prime Minister and the spiritualist Alfred Deakin as its Attorney General. In just over 100 years, Australia's colonial expansion had engulfed the entire continent, turned the bush into paddocks, and developed an enormous agricultural economy. It had given birth to an almost entirely Anglo-Celtic population of new Australians who shared an easygoing culture that they wanted to protect themselves from Asians. The Bulletin would keep its Australia for the White Man slogan until 1960. Britain could overrule Australian laws and High Court decisions until 1986, and the Melbourne to Adelaide rail line did not adopt a standard width gauge until 1995. Within the pro-British architecture of this new nation came the White Australia policy that institutionalised white supremacy and formed the basis of Australia's socio-economic framework well into the second half of the 20th century. At the time of Federation, many new Australians thought the first Australians were simply dying out to make way for a superior race. However, early national census proved that this was not the case. Embarrassingly, Australia's constitution stated that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples weren't recognised as part of the Australian population. It also meant that the states could create their own policies for Indigenous people. This ushered in an era of heavy state paternalism that sought to control the lives of tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples and gave state governments legal rights to remove children from their families. Through the second half of the 20th century, relentless Indigenous and left-wing activism slowly changed perceptions of Australia's First Peoples. For example, the Pilbara strike, the Warburton Ranges controversy, the 1967 referendum, the Wave Hill walk-off, and of course the Mabo decision in 1991, when the High Court of Australia finally recognised that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have rights to their land, rights that existed before the British arrived and can still exist today. In this episode, I've discussed the federation of Britain's far-flung Australian colonies into the modern continental nation we enjoy today. Thanks to tens of thousands of years of Indigenous land management practices, the establishment of strong institutions, the success of our labour movement, and the policy foresight of some of our leaders, today modern Australia is a very enviable place to live. However, like other Western nations, we are haunted by our past. For the brutality of our colonial expansion and the cringe-worthy racialisms that influenced our federation have significantly tainted our history in the context of the 21st century. This episode was influenced by the books Girt Nation by David Hunt and A Concise History of Australia by Stuart McIntyre. I highly recommend them both. Thanks for watching. If you're interested, then please hit the like and subscribe buttons. For the next episode, I'm going to discuss our Anzac tradition. Cheers.